The last sound on the 20th floor that night was a single, unhurried phrase of music. Two hands finding each other across the ivory. A hesitant duet that filled the empty corridor and held the fluorescent lights in abeyance. Jack Rowan pushed the mop with a rhythm that matched the phrase, listening as if each note could stitch something inside him back together. He smelled lemon cleaner and old paper, felt the chill of marble beneath his shoes, and thought of a hospital room where he had once promised a dying child something he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep. Stay with us until the end. You'll want to hear how the music changes everything. If this story moves you, consider subscribing and supporting music education for children with disabilities. He kept the music in a pocket of himself the way other men kept photographs, folded, private, sometimes taken out to be stared at until the edges softened. Mopping around the grand piano, he watched the small figure at the bench. Lily Voss, 9 years old, hair tucked behind ears she did not need to listen. The cleaning cart clinked softly against the handrails, a domestic percussion under the notes that rose and fell like breathing. Jack's hands, calloused at the fingertips with the faintly yellowed crescent from a life of piano strings and hospital nights, paused. He let the mop sit against the banister and allowed his fingers to remember positions on a keyboard that had once been his whole language. Lily's hand hovered over middle C. She did not look at the keys. She felt the air above them as if sound had weight and temperature. Jack crouched until his face was level with her shoulder. He could have left. He was not supposed to be here. The janitor's badge flashed against his chest like a small false sun. But when Lily inhaled and closed the rest of the world away, Jack heard his own old piano teacher leaning down behind him, saying in a voice as thin and present as thread, "Always bring what you can." "Ready?" he asked, soft enough that the amphitheater of marble took the syllable and made it small. Lily's hand slid once, lightly, and the first notes of Debussy's piece rose like a memory. Her fingers curved as though they held invisible threads. Jack matched her, one line, then another, and for a few minutes the building belonged to them both. The music was a conversation made of air and touch. In the dark of her closed eyes, Lily saw color. Jack saw a light he had not allowed himself to want. The hospital memory arrived without warning, as memories do. Fluorescent glare different from the office lights. The antiseptic smell replaced by lemon cleaner in his nostrils. The hiss of a respirator replaced by the piano's gentle swell. He was 29, younger than he felt now, his hair still stubbornly dark. A child named Theo, wrapped in a thin blanket and thin as an idea, lay under a kaleidoscope of machines. His son's breath was a small tide that rose and fell. His skin was warm where Jack's fingers met it. There had been too few words, and the ones that mattered were all the ones he chose in whispers. "I'll keep you with me," Jack had said, leaning close so his voice would not startle the machines. "I'll carry your song. I promise, Theo. Here, with your heart." He closed his hand around the small bracelet the child wore, a thin band with letters rubbed almost smooth. He could not make sense of anything that night but the sound of his own vow. Unaware that the nurse standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms folded and her jaw soft as postponed sleep, had heard every syllable. She had not moved then. She had only watched him say the thing people say when the world has shrunk to a hospital bed and a name, then left without comment. For years, the nurse's image lived in a corner of Jack's mind like a photograph he did not possess. He never saw her again at the time. The hospital room closed on itself like a trapdoor, and he fell away, finding small, practical ways to hold himself upright. Coffee at odd hours, a night job that let him stay close to places where music still happened, even if he had been exiled from making it. In the present, Lily's left hand found a chord. Jack answered with a second that held her line. She smiled with her whole face when the piece rounded itself into a phrase she recognized. "Faster?" she asked, the single word a bright, curious thing. "Not yet," Jack said. "We'll let it breathe. Remember the pause before the last note. That's where everything waits." She laughed. A sound like a bell dropped in soft water, and the janitor's cart made a small metallic clatter. Somewhere in the bowels of the building, an elevator hummed and left the sound to become background. The smallness of the moment was everything. It was also dangerous. The policies were clear. No unauthorized access. No unsupervised contact with family members after hours. No exceptions. Those rules were designed to protect liability and image. They had not been written to protect the soul. Jack thought, for a flicker, of the photograph tucked into his uniform, his daughter's face, the little crown of curls she had once worn, the way she used to fall asleep on his shoulder at symphonies because sound was the only part of the world that felt like a promise. He had given up being a performer the night the car took his wife and their son. He had kept on being a father for the daughter who remained by folding himself small and steady. Music became a memory he visited alone until Lily invited him back into it, one hesitant lesson at a time. The audacity of the thing was part of its sacredness. A janitor teaching the CEO's blind child an old French piece in the heart of a building designed for power. Lily's mother, Clara Voss, was both famous and absent in equal measures. Her name on the foundation's letterhead, her face in program photos. Clara could command rooms with the angle of her chin and build philanthropic empires with the clarity of her spreadsheets. She did not come down to listen to night duets. At 3 in the morning, Lily's laughter dissolved into a quieter concentration. The music room wrapped itself around the pair, and for those hours, the outside world had not yet resumed its business. Jack's fingers remembered the spread and fall of chords with an intimacy that surprised him. Muscle memory and grief braided together to form a language he could still speak. He watched Lily's hands hover, felt the warmth of small palms against his own as she navigated a phrase for the first time. When she made a mistake, she corrected herself gently, as if someone had taught her that errors were not accidents, but conversations waiting for correction. "You play like you hear colors," Jack said, before he could stop himself. He regretted the poetry the moment it left his mouth, but Lily's face brightened all the same. "I do," she replied. "Blue smells like paper. Red sounds like a shout." Jack swallowed the response he had saved for other people, "You keep me playing," and instead watched the way the light caught along the rim of her bracelet. He had noticed it weeks ago when he first found her here, alone and impossibly brave, touching the wood grain of the piano as if reading Braille. The bracelet had small letters. He could not make them out from where he stood. Its presence tugged at an old loose seam inside him, the one where the hospital promise still lingered like a stubborn thread. They kept their lessons secret. It felt right, an unspoken compact forged of necessity. A janitor and a child, a late-night piano, and an unregistered pedagogy. At the border of propriety and compassion, they built a tiny universe. Jack brought sheet music he had kept in a faded folder, music he had believed the world had no room for anymore. He taught Lily to count measures like breaths. She taught him how to listen again to the spaces between notes, not the arena he had once sought to fill, but the silence that makes music possible. Eventually, the rules found them. It did not happen because of malice. It happened because institutions see patterns and decide what to protect. One evening, a maintenance log and a misunderstanding about after-hours permissions collided with Richard, head of building security, trawling for violations to bolster his own tendency toward hard lines. He caught them as they were practicing the last movement of the piece, a moment when Jack's mouth was a line of concentration and Lily's foot tapped the metronome's invisible pulse. "You can't be here," Richard said. His voice was dry paper. "This floor is closed to non-authorized personnel." Lily looked up as if hearing thunder, fingers stilling on the keys. Jack rose slowly, palms open. "We're done," he said. "We were just—" "You know the rules, Rowan." Richard's use of his last name was a weapon honed by many such confrontations. He was not interested in the nuance of teaching a blind child, or in the fact that the child's hands held music as if it were a map. He was interested in the rule. Jack's chest narrowed. He had rehearsed this scene in private 100 times, and always he failed to make it end without a bruise. "She has permission from her mother to be here for after-hours rehearsals," he said, his voice steady, even if his knees were not. In truth, he did not know whether Clara had given permission. Lily's mother rarely attended these hours. Jack's answer was dishonest and sincere at once. He was guarding a fragile truth with a bluff of authority. "You don't have authorization for unsupervised instruction," Richard said. He turned to the radio clipped on his vest, as if a chorus of rule keepers needed no more than his breath to call them. Security would arrive, someone would write a clause into a report, someone would escalate toward the HR inbox where decisions become soft and cruel by degrees. Clara Voss received the complaint the following morning while the sun made the glass of her office glow like a lens. She read the short, emotionless email, unauthorized access, unsupervised child contact, and felt for an instant the pleasant certainty of distance. Complaints were a thing that happened in other people's lives. They did not require the immediacy Clara's hands were used to managing. But her daughter's name was mentioned, and suddenly the complaint had the shape of an intrusion into a private space she had kept oddly compartmentalized. She thought of Lily, her laughter that had once ricocheted childish and accidental off kitchen tiles, and felt a sensation she had tried to file under logistics: unease. The note of the word unauthorized made her chest tighten. She had always prided herself on making decisive, efficient choices. Parenting had become a line item she attempted to manage between flights and meetings. The nurse who had stood outside a hospital room years before and heard a promise Jack Rowan made returned to this story like a weathered bookmark. She worked now in a small health center affiliated with the foundation, and after a late shift had stumbled upon the two of them in the music room. She recognized Jack first, the set of his shoulders, the way he cupped the air as if expecting a chord, and then the child at the bench. She had seen grief shape people before. She knew the way promises sometimes measure themselves in years. She did not report them to Richard. She left and thought about the hospital doorway where vows are sometimes overheard and kept. Clara's impulse at first was corporate: call a meeting, sanction, clarify policy. But words are hydrostatic. They find pressure points. When she arrived at the atrium to see what the fuss was about, because when her name is attached to a cause, she prefers to know the edges of it, she found instead something that made the world she had built feel suddenly very small. Jack, who had no title beyond a cleaning badge, sat at the grand piano beneath a skylight and adjusted Lily's hand to the right place. The notes they made sounded like repair work done on a building that had rusted from the inside. People who had gathered for morning coffee slowed. Phones were lifted for the wrong reasons, not to record scandal, but to capture an obvious, delicate courage. Clara watched from behind the glass walls of her office for a long minute. Something inside her, threaded from memory and regret, began to untangle. The sight of Lily so entirely present at the piano, her head tipped as if listening inward, caught at a place Clara had learned to keep buttoned up. The place where motherhood and responsibility overlapped and often collided. She thought of all the appointments she had kept, and all the times she had substituted expediency for presence. A name on a program could not fix that, but perhaps it could become part of a repair. Later that day, she called a meeting, and it was not a meeting about policy. In the middle of the atrium, where the chandeliers distributed light like a civic prayer, she rose and said words that surprised even her, because they were not part of the script she had practiced in front of glass and glass. "We have people here who make this place humane," she said, not naming anyone at first. "There are contributions that can't be measured on a balance sheet. We will not punish compassion." Richard's face set like a stop sign. He trailed after her through the doors, indignation like a second shadow. "This is insubordination," he began. "There are liability issues." "There are also children who need someone to teach them," Clara cut in, and her voice did something that not many in the company had ever heard. It softened. The room shifted. The board members who had been prepared to negotiate with words found their chairs suddenly less grounded. Clara made a decision in public, the kind of one that rewrites policy by example. She appointed Jack Rowan to lead a pilot program for music education for children with disabilities, tasked the foundation with creating a safe, insured structure for after-hours lessons, and reassigned Richard to a role that would keep him busy with logistics rather than confrontation. Jack still had not intended to be seen. He had been teaching, as he always had, in a kind of sanctified stealth. When Clara's footsteps approached and her card stopped at his name, something in his chest leapt and then fell into a new order. He had not spoken to Clara since he'd taken the job. The history between them was one of proximity without intimacy. He cleaned rooms that she moved through, like sacred spaces she did not touch. Clara came down the marble steps with a brace of intentions behind her. She stepped into the circle of light and looked at Jack, then at Lily. "You teacher?" she asked. "Yes," Jack said. It was a small answer, but true. "You should be paid for this," Clara said, quickly and without rhetorical flourish, which made the generosity heavier somehow. "You should be recognized. I had no idea." Her eyes flicked to Jack's hands, and something in her face shifted again. Recognition or remorse, Jack could not tell. Clara announced the program before she left, a thing that would become larger than the two of them, a thing with its own staff and curriculum and budget line. She announced that Jack would be formally asked to lead the pilot. She issued a public apology for the way the incident had been handled. Her statement included the phrase "human contribution" in a way that made it sound like she had discovered a new currency. In the days that followed, Jack felt his life tilt under a new weight. Restoration had a bureaucratic side, forms, background checks, training, but it also had a tender one, the face of a child who had been given permission to learn in the company of someone who saw her. For Lily, permission came as a relief. For Jack, it felt like the sealing of an old wound. He began to bring in other music, small compositions he had written and never performed for more than his own echo. He brought a worn bracelet with a rubbed inscription and set it on the bench where Lily could touch it. The letters were almost gone. "Here with your heart." He had worn the bracelet since Theo's Rome and had slept with the sound of his promise turned into a loop around his wrist. When he placed it in Lily's palm, she closed her fingers around it reverently, as if a secret had been laid into them. "Where did you get this?" she asked, sensing the weight of the metal like a small planet. "Someone gave me something once," Jack said. He did not say whose hand had been small enough to make him promise, only that promises, once spoken, demanded a kind of tending. Lily slid the bracelet onto her wrist and giggled when the metal sat like a small promise of its own. Weekends shifted. The program grew under Clara's oversight into something that had structure and compassion in equal measure. Parents came to watch their children find music in new languages. Volunteers who had once been comfortable with philanthropy at arm's length learned how to sit and listen. The nurse from the hospital came back sometimes, older and kinder in the way that time can render people. She would sit in the back with a thermos and watch Jack and the children move through scales as if watching seedlings come up after a long frost. There were, of course, setbacks. Richard adjusted to his reassignment by coldly cataloging incidents and sending memos. There were legalities to be ironed out and insurance forms that threaded to reduce a life's worth of compassion to a checkbox. Once, during a program review, a board member asked about precedent and risk, and Clara answered with a kind of conviction people rarely extend to other people. We are a foundation because we believe in the dignity of people's talents. That is the only risk I am willing to take right now. Her voice that day sounded like someone who had stopped priming herself to be infallible and had started to be accountable to a deeper score. Jack's daughter, his reason for all the small, fierce sacrifices he had made, visited sometimes. He kept her visits private because she had her own life, and because grief is a fragile creature not to be paraded for effect. When she sat in the back of the music room, her presence was a quiet anchor. Jack would catch her hand on his way by and feel the solidity of family like a softened callus. He did not speak of Theo often. The hospital's memory had become a map of possibility rather than only loss. The promise spoken in a white room had been overheard by a stranger who kept it like a thread. It was a small miracle of human attention that played out across years and changed the shape of a life. One late autumn evening, a year after that first public announcement, the music hall filled with chairs like a city waiting for a procession. The Helios Foundation Music Hall had been retrofitted for the event, a gala framed as a community concert and program fundraiser. But to Jack and Lily, it was a stage for something older, proof. The lights were warm, and the wood of the stage smelled like varnish and the kind of polish that announces ceremony. When the hall quieted, you could hear the breath of 100 people. Jack sat in the wings, his fingers in his lap. He wore a suit he had not owned before the appointment, something provided by the foundation. It felt strange and right, like shoes that needed breaking in. He looked at Lily, who sat at the center of the stage, waiting for the cue. Her bracelet flashed on her wrist like a small sun. Clara stood near the back, her presence contained but visible, a shape among the audience who had learned to love the consequences of decisions she once made alone. She had, over the year that followed, been a parent more present. The company had become an institution that made room for music and vulnerability as much as profit. Her reconciliation with Lily had not been theatrical. It was slow and full of practical apologies, dinners rearranged, calls returned promptly, hands held in public that had previously been used only for shaking deals. The program began with smaller numbers, children who had taken tentative steps, and then the lights softened and a hush swept across the hall like an expectation. Jack's composition, a piece he had named The Things We Cannot See, was the headline. The title held a double echo, the literal world of Lily's blindness and the invisible labor of people like Jack, whose contributions were often rendered unseen until someone declared otherwise. When Lily walked onto the stage, guided by a volunteer to the piano, the audience recognized what a wound could become, a conduit. She sat and placed her hands on the keys as if old friends had propped them up. The first notes were small and precise, and the hush around them felt like reverence. Jack watched from the wings as Lily's hands traveled the opening phrase. The piece swept through the hall like light through glass, at once transparent and refracted. In the middle of the composition, a line rose that sounded like a memory transposed into the present. Lily's fingers found an unexpected cluster of notes, and the audience held its breath, as if to not startle the sound. There was a gasp near the back, a single human intake, and then the listening resumed. When the music rounded the final chord, sunlight-colored stage lights washed over the faces in the hall, and a softness settled like dusk. Afterward, there was applause, a tide that rose and kept rising, not out of obligation, but because people had been touched. Clara descended from the audience and, without making a speech, crossed to the wings where Jack stood. She took his hand in both of hers and squeezed. The gesture was both apology and gratitude, and the acknowledgement of a debt she would rather pay forward. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple enough to be true. She reached out then and put both hands briefly on Lily's shoulders. The bracelet on Lily's wrist gleamed in the light like a small comet. Jack watched them, and the hospital room he had once known as a place of finality felt far away, receded into the geography of what had to be remembered but no longer had to define the road forward. Later, after chairs had been stacked and the vaulted space had a trace of the night left to it, Jack wandered back to the piano and sat. He placed his hands on the keys and played a small phrase, something private. He thought of Theo's small body and the way promises had found their way into different shapes, a bracelet, a program, a child's steady hands. He closed his eyes and let the sound be both confession and benediction. The nurse who had stood outside that hospital doorway years before sat at the back of the now empty hall with a thermos and watched Jack finish. She had kept a habit of returning to places where she had once found the intensity of someone's vow. She thought, not for the first time, of the fragile ways humans keep their promises, by giving away the things they most treasured and trusting that the gift will continue the promise's life. Jack rose from the bench and walked across the stage. He held out his hand, and Clara and Lily came to him like two currents meeting at a harbor. He slid his own bracelet off and placed it around Lily's wrist once more, the words catching the light, "Here with your heart." Lily laughed, and the sound filled the hall like a repair made public. Outside, the city breathed its indifferent breath. Inside, a program was already forming plans for expansion. Parents made plans to enroll their children. Donors moved their pledges from passive to active. And in the quiet after, Jack walked home with music under his arms and a photograph in his pocket, the one of his daughter asleep on his shoulder, a small proof that even the hardest promises could be kept if people allowed them to be. When he came to the block where his daughter lived, he paused under the same bare bulb that had illuminated so many small goodbyes. He reached into his pocket and smoothed the photo as if it were a talisman, and then folded himself small enough to be invited in. The nurse from the hospital never sought recognition for having heard him that night. She had been, as far as she knew, merely a witness to a man trying to anchor himself with words. Yet that quiet, unintended attendance had turned into a thread that, pulled a decade later, altered the pattern of several lives. Jack thought of her sometimes, a small, plain-faced guardian of secrets that had refused to become gossip. He kept her in the fold of his gratitude, like another modest person among many who had made his path walkable. In the end, the promise whispered in a hospital room did not bring back everything that had been lost. It did, however, call forward acts, unremarkable, stubborn acts that stitched people back together. Music proved to be one of those acts, a language for the unsayable, a place where hands could translate hardship into beauty. Clara learned again how to be present not by decree but by habit. Lily learned how to turn the world of the unseen into public triumph. Jack learned he could keep a vow by becoming generous with the thing he most feared losing, his music. When the program grew into something larger than any one person, Jack sometimes sat in the back of the room and listened. He watched other children hold their hands above keys with the tentative reverence of new pilgrims. He thought of Theo and the bracelet now doubled on Lily's wrist, of a nurse who had heard a whisper and chose to hold it like a light, and of Clara speaking the words that rewrote policy into action. They made a plaque for the music room later that summer. It did not name the hospital or the nurse or the precise composition that had become the emblem of the program. It simply read in modest lettering, "For the unseen contributions that make us human." Jack touched the plaque once and then left his fingers there for a moment longer than needed. At the very end of the year, during a smaller recital meant to show donors what their money had bought in terms of courage and craft, Lily walked back onto the stage and this time began with a single, clear phrase that was like a calling. Jack sat in the audience, his hands folded, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be fully witnessed. to take his place as a man who had kept a promise in fragment and in whole, whose grief had been the soil for someone else's flourishing. The nurse who had heard that whisper so long ago watched from the balcony, a small smile making the margins around her eyes. She had not planned to return to the building that day. The music, she said to herself, had a way of calling people the way a tide calls a shoreline. Jack's promise had once been a thing confined to a hospital room and one desperate night. It had grown, in the patient way that kindness grows, into something that reshaped more than one life. He felt it as a quiet weight and a strange, freeing light. He had learned that the things we cannot see, the vows, the small decisions to stay, become visible when someone finally has the courage to notice them and to make them matter. Outside, the city lights blinked on, holding the promise of another day. Inside, the recital hall emptied slowly, people carrying with them the evidence that an ordinary man had changed the outline of a community by teaching a blind child to hear colors in music and by keeping a promise whispered to the hush of a hospital monitor. The memory of a nurse in a doorway lingered like a soft chord beneath everything, a reminder that sometimes the quietest witnesses are the ones who shift the course of a life by simply being present.